Hi there, welcome to this video. So this is about the 3 levels of biodiversity. So you need to be aware that the 3 types of biodiversity are called levels of biodiversity. So they might use this vocabulary, so just be ready for that. So the first level of biodiversity on the kind of smallest scale is what we call genetic diversity. Okay. The next biggest one is called species diversity, and the largest one is called habitat diversity. So you need to know that there are 3 levels of biodiversity, first of all. So genetic biodiversity, first of all, is about the genes. So remember that a gene is a section of DNA that codes for one protein. And sometimes we have different versions of a gene, which are called alleles. So an allele is a version of a gene. So genetic diversity means the different genetics or the different alleles that we've got within one species. So different versions of a species are sometimes called different breeds. Okay, so we could be talking about different breeds of a species. So within dogs, we've got variation amongst dogs, haven't we? Because we've got different breeds of dogs. And the reason why we've got those different breeds, those different versions, is due to different alleles. And remember, the definition of alleles is a version of a gene. Okay, and because we've got this variation within a species, it makes a species with high genetic biodiversity really good at adapting to changing environments. So if over time an environment changes, for example, the climate changes or the conditions change or a new disease comes along or something like that, a species is more likely to survive because it can adapt to change if it has a high genetic biodiversity, because it might be that some of the versions of the species die, but some versions survive. Some of them have an allele that allows it to survive those changing conditions. Okay, and that means that it's able to adapt, it's enabled to undergo natural selection, which is obviously the basis for evolving and changing over time. Okay, so the higher the genetic diversity, it means that things can adapt to changing conditions. And adapting to changing conditions is called natural selection. Some survive, some die, and they pass on the beneficial alleles to the next generation. The next type of biodiversity is the species biodiversity. Now, species biodiversity, change colour. Species biodiversity includes 2 measures, which are called species richness and species evenness. So let's write those down. Richness and species evenness. So species richness simply means how many different species, the number of different species. So are there 4 different species? SPP for species. Are there 8 different species? Are there 122 different species? How many different species are there in a habitat? Evenness, on the other hand, means how even are the numbers of each of those species. So let's say we had 5 different species. Have we got 2 of each of those 5 species? Or have we got 19 of one and 1 of another, 1 of another, 1 of another, 1 of another? So, you know, are they evenly distributed, or have we got more than one than we have over another? Okay, so basically the proportion of each. And we've got an equation that we can use to measure species diversity, which incorporates richness and evenness, which is called Simpson's Index of Diversity. So I'll put a little note here that we can use Simpson's index of diversity to measure that, and that is a different spec point, so it'll be covered in another video. The third type of biodiversity, the third level, is the largest one, which is habitat diversity. So habitat diversity can sometimes be called ecosystem diversity. Sometimes you might hear it used interchangeably, but basically means how many different habitats are there, the number of different habitats that we've got. Okay, so they could be things like sand dunes or woodland or meadows or streams, things like that. How many different habitats have we got in an area or in an ecosystem? Now, remember that these three levels of biodiversity are dependent on one another. So if we had an increase in one level of biodiversity, it will affect the other levels of biodiversity as well, because if you imagine we got more habitats, then obviously we've got more places that different species could live. So maybe if we got more different habitats, we'd get more different species, so species biodiversity would go up. And maybe the different habitats, the species would need different alleles to live in the different habitats, and therefore maybe even within a species we'd get more different types of a particular species, some that are more adapted to light and some more to shade or whatever, and therefore they'd need different alleles, and it would increase our genetic biodiversity. Another example could be if you had more habitats, then maybe you've got some that are dry and some that are wet, so you need then species that can live in water as well as land, and therefore you need different alleles for that. Maybe you've got habitats that have different levels, so maybe you've got more trees in an area, so you need animals that can live up high up in the trees, and maybe that's different species, or maybe it's just a different version of a species that's adapted to live high up in the trees. Okay, so they do depend on each other, they do change depending on one another as well. The final thing I just want to go through on this spec point, which is slightly off topic but also relevant, is just a few definitions. So the first one is, what are the definitions for a species and a population? Oops, sorry. Population. So a species, hopefully we remember that definition from GCSE. It's just a group of organisms that can reproduce. And when they reproduce, they can give fertile offspring. So their children can have children. Okay. A population is just a group of one species. So a population of humans, a population of rabbits. Okay, but it's just one species. We've got another word then that's similar, which is community. And community is slightly different to population because it can be more than one species. So it can be all the organisms that live there, but it might be made up of 3 different species or something. So more than one species, slightly different there. Another 2 that get a little bit mixed up are habitat and ecosystem. So habitat just refers to the place. I'll simplify that by a tree. Okay, so it could be a tree, a stream, a woodland, under a log, lots of different habitats. An ecosystem is slightly different because it's the habitat, the place, but it's also the organisms that live there as well. So I draw a tree for habitat because it's just the place, whereas an ecosystem is the place and the organism. So it's the stream and everything that lives in the stream, or the woodland and everything that lives in the woodland. Okay, so slight differences. The final word I want to go through in this video is niche. So the word niche is a funny one. It means the role of an organism. And two organisms can't actually have the same niche because one of them will always be slightly different, slightly better adapted and outcompete the other one, and one will survive and one will die. So all organisms, if they live in the same habitat, they must have a different niche. Now, the main thing about a niche is what it eats. So if an organism eats berries, a certain type of berry, the niche of it is not just that it eats the berries, but it's where does it get the berries from? Does it get it from the bottom of the bush or the top of the bush? Does it feed on the berries in the night or in the day? So everything about what it eats and when it eats it and how it gets it, that's the niche of that organism. And if we had two types of organisms that fed on these same berries, if they were to coexist, they need to have a slightly different niche. So maybe it's because one of them feeds on the berries from the bottom of the bush and one of them feeds on the berries from the top of the bush. So they're not actually competing directly, and therefore one doesn't outcompete the other. Okay, so the word niche I just wanted to go through as well. And that's the end of this spec point. 4.2.1 does have another part to it about sampling, and I'll go through that in a separate video.